So thank you very much for inviting, and I guess I had a lower bar than many others in getting accepted. So we started from a paper covering what 40% of world population by Josh, and then we went to John's paper covering several hundred million. Now we're going to look at a paper that covers 1 promille of world population, but I hope I'll keep you entertained nonetheless. And let me start by some motivation. So we already saw graphs of this sort, and so this is by Ufuk on the left-hand side and by John and others on the right-hand side, looking at the US in the 30s and 80s, where we have some measure of parental income percentiles on the x-axis, and we have the probability of the offspring becoming an inventor on the y-axis. And what comes through very clearly is that, well, if you want to become an inventor, make sure you're born to high-income parents. And it's not enough to be at the 90th percentile, you want to be at the 98th or 99th or so. Makes a huge difference. So, going to our exercise, here's the same for Finland, and as you can see, we're looking at cohorts that are between what Ufuk was looking at and what John was and co-authors were looking at. So people born early 50s to 1980. We have the mother's income percentile on the left, father's income percentile on the right, and just to explain you how we calculate these. So we take the parents at age 35, we calculate the income of the cohort across everybody, and then we look at in which percentile the mothers and fathers fall. And you can see the same effect here, so strongly convex all the way to the very end.
Just clarification, is this income of the household, or is it?
No, this is income of either the father or the mother.
How do you handle family businesses, like where you've got presumably two, husband and wife, both working?
Yeah, so then the husband would be on the right and the mother, the wife would be on the left. And so we don't look at household income, we look at income of either parent here.
Is that different from earnings?
No, it's pretty much, so it's earnings, it's entrepreneurial income and capital income, all put together. So our question is, the stereotypical view of Finland is that it's way more egalitarian than the US. It has an equitable educational system. So how come? How can it be that, that in Finland also, if you want to become an entrepreneur, make sure to be born to high-income parents? And that's what we want to understand. That's what this paper is about. Now, the first step towards an answer is this graph here. Again, it's raw data. We have the income percentiles, again, of mothers on the left, fathers on the right. And now we have on the y-axis the probability that a parent in a particular income percentile has a master's degree. And you can see this same convexity, if anything, even more strongly. So it seems that if you judiciously choose to be born to high-income parents, on the side you get highly educated parents. And maybe this has something to do with the first graph. And indeed, if you then look at what happens when you change parental education and you look at the probability of inventing, and let me just walk you through these graphs. So again, we have mothers on the left, fathers on the right, and we start from, we start from base education, secondary, bachelor, master's, and PhD. And let's look at the red and orange ones first. That's the probability of a son becoming an inventor. And by the way, for us, an inventor is somebody who has a European patent in this paper. And you can see that the bars are growing, and the orange bars are for the sons and daughters, the sons of mothers who have a science or STEM PhD, STEM masters, and the red ones are for non-STEM education. You can see a similar increase for daughters. It's sort of harder to see because the absolute levels are smaller. You can see it also for paternal education. And the one sort of outlier is that mothers with a PhD have daughters with a lower likelihood of becoming inventors than mothers with a master's degree. You should remember, though, that we have very few mothers with a PhD. But so, there's an association between parental income and becoming an inventor and parental education and becoming an inventor. And so, what we try to get at in this paper is the causal impact of parental education on the probability of the offspring becoming an inventor. Why do we think this is interesting? Well, of all the possible sort of childhood environmental variables, this is the one most directly affected by policy. Okay, surely over generations, but nonetheless. And that's why we think that this is of special interest, and that's why we zoom on it. And so, how do we go about this? Well, I already told you we're looking at 1 promille of world population, but we have a lot of information on that 1 promille. And so, the way to think about this paper is that think of all the cohorts born in Finland between 1953 and 1980, and we look at whether they become inventors, and we have a lot of data not just on them, but also their parents. And so we know parental income, we know parental education, we know also other things that I'll get into later on. Our main vehicle of inquiry is going to be linear probability models where the left-hand side variable is, did this individual become an inventor, yes or no? And our main variable of interest is a measure of parental education. We're obviously worried about endogeneity, and so we're going to instrument by the distance of the parent at age of 19 to the nearest college, measured from his or her birth municipality. And then we'll do further things to make sure that, that we're less likely to violate the exclusion restriction. We're going to estimate things by first pooling daughters and sons and then by gender. We're also going to estimate a Roy model to get out more than the local average treatment effects. And then finally, to further inquire whether we're still maybe in violation of the exclusion restriction, we're going to use a subsample of our data where we have IQ for the offspring, not the parents. Okay? And I hope I'll have time to go to the final exercise, which is we're going to look at how does the big change in Finnish primary education going from a tracking system to a comprehensive schooling system early 60s, whether that's affected the relationship between parental education and offspring becoming an inventor. So that's what we're going to be doing. Obviously, we're standing on many shoulders and leaning on even more. And so the sort of theoretical motivation comes from growth models where education is an investment. And I think it was Chad who's written somewhere that the more inventors we have, the more ideas we have, and the richer all of us get. And so that's sort of the motivation for this. There's a literature looking at the characteristics and origins of inventors. Many people in the room have contributed to that. There's an adjacent literature where John was the trailblazer looking at the rents to innovation. And again, we have many contributors in the room. And finally, obviously, we're building on the literature that has studied the effect of parental education on offspring outcomes, where mostly the offspring outcome has been offspring education. So we're going to jump over that. But let me point out this paper by Karin Heusel and others who actually have a very nice paper that came out in Management Science that also looks at the association between parental education and the offspring becoming an inventor. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a few words about our data sources. Then we'll go through some descriptive regressions to just understand the associations better. And then we'll spend most of our time with our main instrumental variables regressions. I'll flash you the Roy model results, and then we'll go to the sort of deeper analysis using the IQ subsample and this cohort-specific analysis that I mentioned. So that's what we're going to have ahead of us the next 30 minutes or so. So our data is from Finnish registers, and so it covers essentially everybody. We use the employer-employee data set and several population censi. Obviously, we can match offspring and parents. We make some restrictions there, but that's the start. The IQ data comes from Finnish Defense Forces, and just to explain you how it works, once you enter military service, you perform an IQ test. We have that information for those who've done their military service 82 or later. Think of 19-year-old boys. Okay. The cohorts that we're studying, the coverage was very high. It's still like 75%. And just to explain the selection, 1 or 2% of each cohort even today decide to do unarmed service. Some 10 plus percentage points now are rejected by the military before they enter the service, and another 10% or so decide, or the military decides for them during the first 8 weeks, the boot camp, that this is a bad match, you better go home. And there's research showing that this selection is not consequential for the type of exercises we do, and as I said, for the cohorts we're interested in, the coverage is better than it is currently. And finally, our measure of inventiveness comes from the European Patent Office, so we use EPO patents. And we have the universe of patents where at least one Finn was one of the inventors. And so we end up with a sample where we have essentially all individuals born between 53 and 80 with the exclusion that if we can't match them to both parents, then we throw them out. We want to have both parents in there. We also restrict, we exclude people who were born to really sort of older parents, and we end up with slightly shy of 1.5 million individuals, and we have some 10,000 inventors in our data. So that's the raw material we're working with. So how to get at these associations I showed you? We run a bunch of purely descriptive regressions, where the idea is to ask, well, you saw the raw data, the idea is to ask, does the parental income probability to invent relationship change once we control for education? And so what we're going to be doing is, the outcome variable is, are you an inventor, yes or no? We have some controls. We have a very flexible functional form for the parental income percentile because we want to match the raw data. And then we estimate the model with and without this G function. And the G function takes in essentially the dummies that you saw in the histogram. So what type of an education does your parent have, mother or father? Is it STEM or not? Is it master's, PhD, whatever? And then we compare the outcomes. And so I'm showing these graphs for daughters only. The graphs for sons are very similar. And so these blue graphs are essentially replicating what you saw before. So that's just looking at parental income percentiles and offspring invention. And then the red graph is what we get when we take out the association with parental education. And you can see that it gets a lot flatter even at the right. Okay? Now, obviously, these are all associations, but this does suggest that maybe in people choosing their parents, it's at least as much education as it is income that is of consequence regarding becoming an inventor. And so, then to get at whether this indeed is the case, we estimate equations of the form written up here. So this is essentially, think back to Mincer log wage equations, where you have a measure of education as the key variable of interest, and you would have log wage on the left-hand side. What do we change from that? Well, we don't have log wage, we have a dummy, are you an inventor or not, and we have some other outcome variables as robustness tests. And our D here is not the person's own education, but it is the education of the parents. Okay. To be able to stick as closely to this specification widely used in economics, we mainly work with a measure of parental education that takes value 1 if at least one of the two parents has a master's degree, and it's 0 otherwise. Okay? This way we can just have one variable of parental education, and then we do some variance that I'll explain later on. Our instrument is going to be the distance to college of a given parent in the year that he or she turns 19, roughly the time when you choose whether or not to go to university and which university to attend. Now, this is a great instrument and a problematic instrument for the reason that it has a pedigree in economics. So that's great. On the one hand, we're familiar with it. We're also familiar with the problems related to it. And so parents are not randomly allocated in space, but they do choose where to live. And so we worry about the possibility that parents that live close to universities are systematically different from parents who live further away, also in terms of the unobservables that have to do with their offspring becoming inventors. Okay? And there's reason to worry. So in the literature, there's this paper by Carneiro and Heckman who show, using data just on the individuals, not the parents, that the distance to college and IQ are negatively correlated. Well, we find exactly the same regarding parental distance to university and offspring IQ. Okay? That's the reason why we do the IQ subsample. And so how do we go about this? Well, our first solution is thanks to the Finnish government, which over decades established new universities at different locations. And I don't have time today to go into the details, but in the paper with Toivanen, we actually went through the archives of this decision making, and sorry to shatter your possible perception of Finland being an organized society, the decision making was really stochastic and even chaotic, and the outcomes were random, both regarding locations and timing of the establishment of universities. The second thing we do is we come up with controls for what the birth municipality of a given parent looks like, to further clean out correlation between our instrument and epsilon I. And so what do we have here? We have the cohort size, so how many kids were born in that municipality in that year. What did that cohort look like? What fraction of those went on to get a master's degree, excluding the parent in question? What fraction of that cohort went on to earn above median income of the cohort, again excluding that parent? And finally, what fraction went on to earn so much that they are in the top 10% of that cohort's income at age 35? Okay. So we think these help us controlling for the childhood environment in ways that make our instrument strategy more plausible. Just to give you an idea, so here's the map of Finland. Finland is the size of Germany, the unified Germany. Germany has 80-something million people. Finland had 4.5 million at the time, or 4 million at the time of our data. To give a US comparison, I think Massachusetts is like 1/30 of Finland in size. And so what you see here, universities initially were in Helsinki for our purposes, and then you can see how more of them were established. And just to give you one example, University of Oulu up here, established in 1959. Before that, the closest university was in Jyväskylä, and so you can imagine that all kids born up here had a huge reduction in distance to nearest college. And that's what we're going to be exploiting in our estimations. Our data doesn't have enough variation for us to exploit only that variation, so we're also going to use the cross-sectional variation, and then these birth of municipality controls come in handy. But let me just show you that these university establishments make a difference in distance to college. So here's the median distance to college. That's University of Jyväskylä, that's University of Oulu, and you can see sharp drops in the median and the top quartile of distance, not so much for the lower quartile, both for mothers and for fathers. So that's where the variation comes from, and we can show that a lot of our parental cohorts actually are hit by these establishments. To give you an idea of how these controls work, we've correlated log maternal distance to nearest university and log paternal distance to nearest university, first with our outcome, negative correlation, with our measure of parental education, negative correlation, with the probability that the parent in question has a master's degree, with the size of the birth cohort in that municipality, with the fraction of people in that that cohort getting a master's degree, earning above median wage, earning top 10% wages, and finally, offspring IQ. All negative correlations. And notice that these correlations here are way stronger than the correlation with offspring IQ. So we hope they're doing a decent job in cleaning out unnecessary correlation between our instrument and the error term. Okay, going to our main results. Lots of numbers. Let's start from the top. That's all children. Then we go to daughters and sons. And let's go across here. So that's our OLS coefficient. In the second column, we have an IV estimate where we use only maternal distance. 3, we use only paternal distance. And 4, we use the distances of both parents as instruments. And so what you see, first of all, is we have a downward bias in our OLS estimate, which is not at all unheard of in the Mincer literature or in the previous literature looking at own education and becoming an inventor. Secondly, we find that when we use maternal or paternal distance as instrument, we get quite different point estimates. This suggests that these are local average treatment effects. The point estimate is affected by the instrument you're using. Okay? These are big numbers because the mean of the dependent variable is like 2/3 of a percentage point. So economically speaking, these are huge impacts. Let's then look at daughters. We have the same sort of pattern. Notice though that when we use maternal distance, we get an estimate of 1% and it's not statistically significant. When we use paternal distance, we get a coefficient twice the size and it's statistically significant. So this seems to suggest that daughters' probability of becoming an inventor is really the result of movements in father's education. Okay? Going to the lowest panel, the same thing for sons. First thing you notice are the numbers are bigger. That's because the majority of inventors are men. And notice here that we get an estimate of like 9% when we use maternal distances and an estimate of 4% when we use paternal distances. So the size is reversed. And so it seems that if anything, sons are affected by maternal educational choices, daughters by paternal educational choices. The F-tests are the F-tests of our instrument vector, and so you can see we're doing relatively okay there. So to summarize, downward OLS bias in line with the literature, but against the idea that the thing that we really have to worry about is unobserved ability that is positively correlated with both parental education and probability of becoming an inventor. The correlation is actually, if anything, negative. We have local average treatment effects, and we get larger estimates for sons, but once you relate them to the baseline, the impacts are actually larger for daughters. So the relative increase is bigger for daughters. It's not going to help narrowing down the male-female gap, though, because the absolute numbers are what they are. Turning then to our Roy model, the great thing about the Roy model is you get these other treatment effects nicely estimated. And so I'm not going to go into the details of how exactly we do this. So I'm happy to talk about that offline. We have the local average treatment effect just to give you a comparison. And the main interest, let's start from column 1 where we have sons and daughters, is that here's the average treatment effect on the treated. So these are people who had at least one MSc parent. And average treatment on the untreated, so these are people who had no MSc parent. And you can see that, well, this is bigger than that, but also this is highly significant. And you compare this to the baseline of 2/3 of a percentage point. And this is a big number economically speaking. And so that suggests that parental education would have been beneficial even for those who were not lucky in the parental lottery. Yeah, in terms of becoming an inventor, who knows how lucky they were otherwise, just to be clear. Okay, what else do we do? Instead of using a master's degree as a measure of education, we use a bachelor's degree. What happens is we essentially replicate everything you've seen, but the coefficients come down. this suggests that actually it's not only parental education, but the level of parental education that is helpful in turning your offspring into inventors. We use the number of parents with an MSc as a measure of parental education, and we replicate what we have. We change the dummy outcome variable to number of patents or the citations to all of your patents, and we get essentially what you've seen so far.
So you probably already did this in an earlier paper also, but say you use wages as an outcome instead of patents. Well, how do things line up? Do they look the same or different? Or,
That's a good question. We actually haven't done that, but it should line up nicely. But that would be that's now a guess instead of based on us having done it.
But there may be interesting differences, right?
Yeah.
So it might be that those higher things are less important.
That could be, and there could be also important differences across gender. So that's something we haven't done. Okay, let's then move to the further analysis. And so the first thing is worrying about, well, maybe our exclusion restriction still isn't watertight. What can we do? In particular, whether it could be that parents through their genes also contribute to unobserved things that affect the probability of becoming an inventor, and those unobservables are correlated with the parental educational decisions. We have one such measure, and that's IQ. And just to motivate why it might make sense, so here we have the IQ percentile. So this is not the IQ score. So not all Finns have an IQ less than 100, although you might sometimes think that way, living among them. But these are percentiles, and you can see the same convexity here. Okay. So in terms of becoming an inventor, it's good to be high IQ, and it's super good to be super high IQ. And so clearly there's a correlation between IQ and the probability of becoming an inventor. Now, luckily we're in a position to take this into account, and that's what we do. But of course, this is only for a subset. So these are sons born essentially 62, 63 onwards. And so to give you a baseline to compare with, I printed out here the results for sons from the whole sample, okay? And now the way we do this exercise is first we take the IQ subsample and we run our previous model without the IQ variables, just to see how much zooming in on the subsample changes our results. And so you can see how we had an OLS coefficient of 0.026, now it's 0.029. We had an IV estimate with maternal distances of close to 9%, now it's 7.5%. Paternal distances, it was 4, now it's 5.7. And finally, the one using both parents' distances are very close. So it seems we're sort of in the same ballpark, although this is a selected sample time-wise. Okay. Then we throw in the IQ variables. We have, I guess, a fourth order or third order polynomial in IQ percentiles. They are highly statistically significant jointly. And now we can compare these numbers. And so you can see that the OLS coefficient goes down, all of the IV coefficients go down, all in all by some 1/5 to more than 1/3. But we retain statistical significance, okay, marginally here, but at better than 5% level here. And so it seems that IQ actually might be missing from our previous specification. But even when throwing in IQ, we still get economically very significant and statistically significant point estimates. And so John.
So there's literature on how much IQ is really a measure of ability and how much of it is actually learned or from either at school or from your parents. You have a design where you could get that, I think, because you have the quasi-random assignment of parents to getting more education. Mm-hmm. Do you see an effect on that of the kids' IQ? Because that would, if you did, that would obviously suggest it's not actually.
Yeah, that's an excellent suggestion.
It's not innate,
that's something we ought to do. We haven't done that. Yeah, I mean, there's a literature that suggests that especially the visual spatial IQ that we're using is not very malleable to the environment. But yeah, that's a bit of an open question. Yeah, but so thanks for pointing that out. And really, as a reminder, we're not using average IQ, we're using visual-spatial IQ.
We play against ourselves in a sense here. Yeah. We attribute none of the IQ to education. Yeah. And still we find an IQ.
Just a small question. I was wondering, even what you showed previously, why I had in mind that maybe if you are a daughter, you will follow the role model of your mother, and the opposite when you are a boy. So I'm not very familiar with this literature, but I mean, is it a result that you find elsewhere, or I mean, do you have an explanation for this?
So let's start from the back. I don't really have an explanation. Second, the literature on these sort of gender differences between parental influences and offspring outcomes regarding invention is pretty thin. And so the one paper I know is the one that I mentioned by Karin Heusland and co-authors. And I have a student working on that. And it doesn't always go the way it's going with us that in the existing thin literature. But for us, it's sort of a roundabout way because we're not measuring directly either father's education as the sort of treatment or mother's education as the treatment, but rather through where do we see the local average treatment effects bite in, depending on whose distances we use as an instrument. Okay, so seems with IQ, we still have a reason to think that parental education plays a role. Let me then turn to the final thing we do, which is to ask the question that we've been avoiding judiciously so far, which is, well, what about the educational system that the individual in question goes through? So think of now the offspring, not the parents. And there have been changes in this. And in particular, Finland changed in the early 60s from a tracking system to a comprehensive school system. And so this was not a small change. So prior to that, selection would happen at age 10. And you would either go on an academic track or you would go on a vocational track. The vocational track might last only 5 extra years. The academic track would last at least until till age 15 and most of the time until age 18 and graduation from high school. And then with the comprehensive schooling system, everybody was educated more or less in the same system until age 15, and then you had the choice between an academic and a vocational track. Now, this has so many good things in Finland, was copied from Sweden after we first tested it on Swedes, and it seemed to work. But we still rolled it out in a staggered setting. And so it was introduced over time so that the first cohorts that entered it were born 61, and the last cohorts that were partially entering it was the 1965 cohort. So revealing my age, I was in the first cohort in my hometown that entered comprehensive schooling. And the people born the year after me, no matter where in Finland, they would go through comprehensive schooling. Now, as great as our data is, we don't know exactly who in these early 60s cohorts went through either the comprehensive schooling or the tracking, even though it was most of the time not a choice because it was based on your municipality. Okay? And so what we do is we exclude these 5 cohorts and we look at the last 5 cohorts that all went through the tracking system and the subsequent 5 cohorts that all went through the comprehensive schooling system. And we compare the outcomes. So essentially we're running the estimations you've seen so far, but separately for these 2 sets of cohorts. Now to give you an idea of what the raw data looks like, what we're plotting here is the following. So we've calculated the probability of becoming an inventor if you were either in the, let me call this the old cohort and this the young cohort, and we take the ratio of those by income percentile. And so if the ratio is above 1, then the kids in the younger cohort are more likely to become inventors than kids in the old cohort who had a mother in the same income percentile. And so what you see on the left is a local polynomial of that ratio estimated over all income percentiles, and here for fathers. And what you can see is that it's above 1 for essentially everybody, but at the very left where the estimate is very imprecise. So it seems for no matter what income, the younger cohorts are more likely to become inventors than the old cohorts. And the bump is the biggest for people who were not quite accurate in their choice of parents, and so they landed up with medium income parents. But it was a less bad choice in the late 60s than it was in the late 50s, regarding both mothers and fathers. And so, what we then do is we estimate our model exactly like in table 1, but for these two sets of cohorts separately. And let's have a look at the upper panel. That's the older people. We still have an OLS downward bias. We get a very large estimate for when we use maternal distances, a large but imprecise estimate when we use paternal distances, and an estimate of 4.5% when we use both. So that's the baseline. And then let's compare them to the younger cohort. You can see the OLS coefficient being larger, reflecting what I just showed before. The younger cohorts are more likely to become inventors than the older cohort. But look at the coefficients. So now the coefficient on parental education when we use maternal distances goes down by 90%, almost 85%, and it's not statistically significant. The coefficient using paternal distances goes down by 40%, and again is not statistically significant. And even the coefficient using both parents' distances goes down by like 1/3, although it's statistically significant. And so let me just stress that we don't think this is the definitive answer of which type of school system better is more enabling people, kids from not so educated backgrounds, from not choosing their parents wisely to become inventors, but it is suggestive that introducing the comprehensive school decreased the association, the impact, the causal impact of parental education on the offspring becoming an inventor. So making Finland more egalitarian or less unequal, whichever way you want to look at it.
That's really interesting, but are the coefficients genetically different?
No, so they're not, and thanks for pointing that out. So no, we cannot reject the null that these are the same. As good as the data is, clearly either that could be because they're not different or we're just lacking power. But the reduction in economic significance is still, I think, noteworthy.
How do you explain it jumping up by tenfold when you instrument it?
Here.
Yeah.
So what we see overall is, let me just go back to the initial table. We do see big jumps overall, like here. It's not tenfold, but it's still 3.5-fold. And so and here it's more than threefold. So we do have big jumps overall. And so yes, that's the biggest jump we have, but I don't think it's sort of out of the ordinary when you contrast it to the rest of our results. So let me conclude. So in Finland also, there's a strong association between parental income and the probability of becoming an inventor. It turns out, though, that when you change parents to higher income parents, you also get more highly educated parents. And so that's what we're looking at. We instrument parental education with distance to university. We try to be careful in justifying our instrument using the variation in our data and then controlling for unobservables that, if left out, might cause correlation between our instrument and the error term. And we find that, indeed, even on a level of association, once you control for education, the relationship to parental income isn't quite wiped away, but is greatly diminished. Parental education has a causal impact on the offspring becoming an inventor, and the effects depend on which parent is induced by our instruments to get an MSc, and it depends on whether the offspring is a daughter or a son. And so the absolute effects are larger for sons, the relative impacts are larger for daughters. Our Roy model suggests that the impact would also affect those who were not targeted by this intervention of having highly educated parents. Throwing in IQ weakens the results, but they're still there. And it seems that Finnish comprehensive schooling made the playground more equal in terms of the offspring becoming an inventor. Thank you so much.